Hello, and welcome back to my video segment called See You in Hell, a video series in which I talk about prominent right-wing figures in history. This is a controversial one. This week I'm talking about Martin Heidegger, who's more likely known to you as a philosopher than as a fascist, but as we'll see, he probably deserves at the very least both. Martin Heidegger was born to a father, Friedrich Heidegger, who was a church sexton. That means a person who lives on the grounds of a Catholic church and maintains it. He was also a cooper, that is a person who repairs barrels. He was born in Meßkirch in Baden-Württemberg, which is in the far southwest of Germany. And his mother's family had been farmers in that region for an extremely long time. His family, like I said, lived in the sexton quarters of the church, the Catholic Church, where his father served, where he and his brother Fritz worked for their father, doing little errands, ringing the church bells, that sort of thing. All in all, a fairly idyllic pastoral life. Martin did so well in school that his local parish priest, the person that his father worked for, suggested that he not even go to gymnasium, the high school option for Germans at the time. Instead, he suggested that he go to seminary and study to be a priest. This was what Martin Heidegger wanted, and it very much pleased his mother. That's what she wanted for her son. She was a very ardent and devout Catholic. And so Martin Heidegger left his hometown and went to a much, much bigger city, Konstanz, which is on the southern border of Germany. It borders on Switzerland, and it has been a university city for an extremely long time, many centuries. He eventually then relocated from Konstanz to Freiburg, another city in southwestern Germany, another city that has a long history of being a university town. The young Martin Heidegger studied theology and tried to become a Jesuit for several years. However, he was very quickly rejected from the Order of the Society of Jesus, that is, the Jesuit order, because he was experiencing a lot of heart troubles. This made the people who he would have been serving decide that possibly this guy didn't really have it in him to be a Jesuit, which is kind of funny because like Jesuits are well known among the priesthood for like being mostly people who are like academics, like they sit and read and stuff, you know, they function in education. And so they think like, well, this guy's too fragile to be like a teacher, a professor, does not bode well for our young intellectual Heidegger. And so he leaves and abandons his ideas about joining the priesthood and instead moves on to study theology as a layperson. This was what he tried to do, again, for several years, but he faced a lot of setbacks. At this time in Heidegger's career, we begin to see some of his relationship to the philosophical concepts that he will be grappling with for the remainder of his academic life. He is upset with the decadence of the modern, this sort of like 19th century idea that the modern world is taking away or has already taken away the beauty and splendor and magnificence of everyday life or, some sort of mystical divine truth. Heidegger was among a large group of philosophers who believed this. This was very close and important to him as a youth, but he continued to experience troubles with his health and eventually had to abandon his studies as a theologian and moved towards much more secular pursuits. He briefly moves to study the physical sciences, like to become a regular teacher at a regular school, but eventually manages to squeak by with a doctor in philosophy in 1911. He then moves on and becomes essentially a sort of budding philosopher, but his career is not doing extremely hot. He is ultimately, in many senses, a lecturer, a contingent academic, somebody who isn't in a particularly situated place. In 1914, World War I breaks out. Heidegger is of an age where he could have been conscripted to join the German Imperial Army, but his heart troubles mean that he is spared this, at least for now. He continues during the war to work at the University of Freiburg, and while working there, marries his wife, Elfriede Petri. During the last year of the war, Heidegger does serve in the German military, but essentially as a desk officer at a meteorology department in the Western Front, with France, and is eventually an assistant to Husserl, a German philosopher who became extremely influential on Heidegger, especially when it came to the concept of phenomenology, phenomenology being a branch of Western philosophy that studies things as we experience them, as opposed to based on their true nature. Shortly after World War I, Martin Heidegger deconverts from Catholicism, which is huge for him. Remember, this is a guy who had been raised in the Catholic Church, literally, like he lived on church grounds, and his mother wanted him to be a priest, and he studied the priesthood, and he didn't just want to be a priest, he wanted to be a Jesuit, a particular and very hard kind of priest to be. The timeline of his academic life then begins to accelerate after World War I. In 1923, he becomes an associate professor at Marburg, and in 1927, his big philosophical production, Being and Time, is released. In 1929, he becomes a full professor and succeeds his mentor, Husserl, at Freiburg University. This is where he will remain for the majority of his academic and personal life. At this point, Heidegger appears to be a relatively apolitical philosopher. But it's the late 1920s and bleeding into the early 1930s. Like a lot of people, Martin Heidegger is getting swept up in the fervor, the imagination, the ideas behind what we now call Nazism. The Nazi Party already existed, and Heidegger had mostly steered clear of it. He didn't really care about it, didn't really engage with it that much. But starting in the late 1920s, and certainly by the early 1930s, as the Nazi Party continues to gain power and influence, not just in academia, but throughout the entirety of German social and political life, Heidegger, like a lot of intellectuals, begins to take notice. This coincides with the full flowering of Heidegger's academic prowess and importance. He is elected to a faculty leadership position at Freiburg University, where he continues to hold his professorship. And then on May 1st, 1933, shortly after Hitler's seizures of power, Martin Heidegger joins the Nazi Party. He is a card-carrying member of the Nazi Party. He's a Nazi. Now, let's take a break from talking about Nazis to talk about Heidegger's philosophies. Heidegger's philosophy is famously complicated. It's famously hard to read and hard to understand. Heidegger's philosophy is a development from the phenomenology of his predecessors and is instead mostly described as and understood as an ontology. Ontology is the study of what is, of being, and that's why his book is called, his main book, right, Being and Time. Being and Time, unlike other ontological texts, doesn't just ask, why is there something rather than nothing? Instead, Heidegger asks the question, what is the nature of being? What does it mean when we say that something is? This is ultimately Heidegger's big philosophical question. And Heidegger's answer is essentially that we have to be in the world, and that therefore we have to also be in time, that the finite nature of existence defines it and makes it worthwhile, makes it possible, makes it what it is, that being can only happen in time. This is a massive simplification. I guess I recommend that you read Being in Time if you want to, but again, remember, guy was a Nazi. For many Western philosophers, not only back in the 20th century when Heidegger was alive, but also today, Being in Time is up there with the phenomenology of spirit, with Plato's Republic, with, Aristotle's discourses. Like, this is a very influential book. It was written before Heidegger joined the Nazi Party, but it was popularized when he was a party member. And Heidegger's being a party member has remained an extremely controversial aspect of his life. It's something that a lot of people, not just today, but back then, were really wrestling with. Because again, this guy was smart, and he had a lot of great ideas about philosophy and understanding the nature of existence and the nature of reality. But he joined the Nazi Party. Now, at this time, in order to be an influential, powerful German, probably in order to maintain his professorship, and certainly in order to maintain his faculty leadership at a leading university in Germany, yeah, he would have had to at least been tolerant of the Nazi Party, and he probably benefited massively from joining it. But importantly, it's important to remember, nobody forced him to join. He didn't have to. He could have done something else. He could have left. He could have refused to join the party. He could have spoken out against it. But he didn't do those things. Instead, he joined the Nazi Party. And he participated in the suppression of Jewish intellectuals, Jewish intellectual output, and Jewish academics. He personally was involved in the suppression of Jewish academic output by refusing to allow his students to cite Jewish academic material. This having been something that Hitler and the higher-ups in Germany demanded. He also has been credibly accused by many former Jewish colleagues of being discriminatory against Jewish people. Heidegger, at the time, in the early 1930s, was known by many of his friends to be a full-fledged revolutionary. Somebody, like many of the young intellectuals at the time, or middle-aged intellectuals at the time, somebody who had been really caught up in the idea of the renewal, the new world that the Nazis were producing. Heidegger very apparently believed this, and many of his colleagues identified him as having been swept up in this narrative. His close friend, Karl Jaspers, said that he was, quote, swept up in the intoxication of the revolution of 1933. Heidegger went so far as to say that the Nazi takeover of Germany was a sort of national emergence from Plato's cave. In modern parlance, that means that he thinks that Germany took the red pill, right? That they saw through the illusions of the world and were rebuilding things from the ground up. Now, that's just Nazi stuff. That's just Nazi ideology espoused by what many people consider to be one of the most influential thinkers in the Western canon in the modern world. The thing is, though, what I've presented to you is so far only the negative side of what Heidegger did. There are a lot of academics, a lot of people who were contemporaries of his, and a lot of his friends and defenders since then who have alleged that, like, if you read his documents, you see oblique references that are criticisms of Nazism, you see him defending Jewish colleagues, you see him being defended by Jewish colleagues. Among these are Hannah Arendt, and other colleagues who were not Jewish but who also defended him include Jean-Paul Sartre, the communist French intellectual. But the fact remains that Heidegger participated directly in the fascist takeover of the German academic world. In 1933, he joined the Cultural Political Working Community of German University Teachers, a long-winded name for essentially what it meant was like a working group that controlled German university output and tried to make it influenced by Nazi ideology. Heidegger's collaboration with and praise of the Nazi Party eventually came to bite himself in the butt. During World War II, he continued to teach and function as a professor at the University of Freiburg, but like all older people, by the time that the war was concluding and the writing was on the wall that the Nazis were losing, he was eventually conscripted to do manual labor for the Nazi Party. In 1944, he was conscripted to join the Volkssturm, a kind of home guard doing manual defensive labor, digging trenches, building walls, things like that. After 1945, when the war was over, he was hit by denazification and barred from teaching any university classes or publishing any material until 1949, again, because he was a member of the Nazi Party and remained a member until its dissolution in 1945. After the war, Heidegger's reputation was sullied, but it had a big renaissance in the late 1940s and 1950s, in no small part due to his many defenders, like I said, many of whom were Jewish or even communists. Heidegger then moved on to continue to write, although he never wrote anything quite as seminal and influential as Being and Time. He wrote in his collected essays, he tried to collect the entirety of his body of work, and gave lectures not just in Germany, but throughout the world. Heidegger died peacefully on May 26th in Freiburg at his home, and actually had a Catholic service returning to the Catholicism of his birth, presided over by his nephew. His reputation was somewhat controversial and complicated for quite some time. However, a recent book by Victor Forois has exposed a lot of his personal writings, showing how he was apparently very personally anti-Semitic. This was stuff that was hidden not just to his friends, but to his collective defenders, people who supported him and people who tried to make us forget that this, possibly the most influential 20th century philosopher of all, was a Nazi. Heidegger is a complicated case, but I'm a simple man. He joined the Nazi Party. So, Martin Heidegger will see you in hell.